Okay, so Marjorie and myself will be moderating today's webinar, and we're going to go over a few of the functions of Zoom today before we get started. So today we're going to be using the Q&A function for answering any of your questions. So you'll see in the bottom of your screen the Q&A button that you can open, and essentially we're asking everyone to submit your questions through there. That'll be the easiest way to organize questions today. And when you submit a question, you should be able to see everyone else's questions throughout the webinar. So you know, if you see that someone already posed a question that you're wondering, you can hold off and wait for that to be answered. And if you feel like it didn't get answered, you can always follow up with another question. So use that Q&A function throughout the webinar. We will have a session, probably about 15 minutes towards the end of today's presentation, to kind of cover those questions more intensely. But if something urgent comes up, you don't want to forget, feel free to throw it in there and we'll get to it. You can also, in your chat box, if you are just joining us, feel free to respond to all panelists and attendees. Let us know where you are joining us today. And I believe everyone's muted, so background noise shouldn't be a problem. And I think that's most of the components I wanted to cover here. So we're going to be covering invasive plant ecology and ID. And I'm very excited to have Nancy Olmstead join us. She is an invasive plant biologist with the Maine Department of Agriculture, Conservation, and Forestry. And I'll let her talk a little bit about what her job is and her role with the department.
Great, thanks, Pamela. Yeah, so I work for the Department of Agriculture, Conservation, and Forestry in a small program called the Maine Natural Areas Program. And our mission is really to help conserve Maine's natural resources. And so we are focused on inventory of rare and high quality habitats and rare plants. And because invasive plants are a threat to those features, we also have invasive plant initiatives. And so that's my role. I do a lot of education and outreach events like this, as well as host the central repository, the online data tool IMAP Invasives for Maine, which is our central repository for data about invasive plants and other invasive species also in Maine. I also go out and do inventory and mapping on land that's owned by the state of Maine and provide management recommendations for the land managers about invasive plants and respond to questions from the general public about how to manage invasive plants. So I think, Pamela, shall I go ahead and start my sharing my screen from my slideshow?
Yeah, go ahead.
Great. Okay. I'm hitting that little button. Try that again. There we go. Okay, and I'll share my PowerPoint presentation. And I'll go to the beginning. Thanks for your patience here, folks. Great. So Pamela, can you advise me, am I my first slide showing up for you? Wonderful. Yes. I'm getting a nod of the head. Okay. Yeah, so as I said, I work on invasive plant ecology and identification. And so some of the plants that are of top concern are plants such as ornamental jewelweed that you're seeing in this photograph here on the left. This is an herbaceous plant that is becoming more widespread in Maine, still somewhat restricted in its distribution. And another plant that many people probably recognize is Japanese barberry. This is a dense infestation of barberry in Wells, Maine, crowding out other native plants in the understory. So these are the kinds of plants that I work on. And as I noted, I work for the Maine Natural Areas Program, where our mission is to ensure the maintenance of Maine's natural heritage. And as I said, we are an organization that prides ourselves on keeping track of data and providing that information, that scientific information, to decision makers like land managers. So welcome to all the land managers who are tuning in today, whether you manage your own residential property or perhaps a family forest, or I know we have some land trust staff on the call. So the Maine Natural Areas Program is here to serve you. So thanks for your attendance today. So when we start thinking about invasive plants, I want to start with a definition of an invasive species, because this can be confusing. The way that we think about invasive species at the Natural Areas Program is that they are a non-native species whose introduction causes economic or environmental harm or harm to human health, and it can establish and spread in minimally managed habitats. So that's a paraphrase of a federal definition, and I consider it sort of a working definition that focuses on the fact that the species is non-native, so it didn't exist here prior to European colonization. It causes harm, and it can establish and spread in minimally managed habitats or natural areas. So these are plants which are beyond weedy. They're not just on the side of the road. They can also colonize our forests or our wetland habitats. And good examples of this are plants like Japanese knotweed, which you can see in bloom here on the left along one of our rivers. That is a plant which can form dense monocultures and inhibit the regeneration of beneficial plants below it. On the right, you're seeing burning bush in the fall, the flush of red foliage coming out here in this, adjacent to this small pond or wetland. And that's an example of another, unfortunately, escaped horticultural plant that can do real well in our natural areas. So that's kind of our working definition. And with that in mind, the good news is that most non-native species are not invasive. So out of every approximately 100 exotic species that are introduced to North America, only about 10 become established outside of cultivation. So those are plants we might refer to as naturalized. They can reproduce and spread, and those can be weeds. But of those, only about 1 to 5 can become invasive. And so those are the ones that are beyond weedy. Again, these are ones that are capable of getting into an understory of a forest or into an open wetland, for example, and causing ecological harm. So that number, the 1 to 5, does include things that are agricultural weeds. And I want to just pause and note that agricultural invasive species are very important and obviously cause a lot of economic harm. And they're not our focus at the Natural Areas Program. Colleagues at Cooperative Extension actually are very well versed in invasive weeds of agricultural areas like row crops and hay fields. I'm sure many people know about smooth bed straw, for example, which is a terrible invasive weed of hay fields. So today in this webinar, I'll be focusing on those invasive plants that are of top concern for the Natural Areas Program because they exist in those minimally managed habitats. But obviously, we recognize that the agricultural invasives are just as important in their own systems. So this is kind of good news regarding non-native species, but I'll touch on later in the talk about why using native species can have additional benefits. But it's true that only a small percentage of non-native species become invasive. And this is the number for plants. For other groups of organisms like insects or snails or earthworms, the numbers vary, so they can be larger. But this is just the numbers for plants. In terms of how these plants arrive here, Lehan et al. Did a review, and this was published in the Journal of Botany in 2013. And they found that 60% of introductions were deliberate. And those numbers are shown here in red, and they are 8% for forage. That kind of surprised me. I hadn't been aware of that as a route of introductions. 40% for horticulture, for plant sales, for gardening and landscaping. 4% for quote unquote conservation. So these were brought to stabilize loose soil or mine tailings or other kinds of reclamation sites. And then 7% were brought deliberately, but the authors couldn't determine the reason. And 3% were brought for medicinal purposes, which again was an interesting thing for me to learn. I hadn't been thinking about that prior. 11% of the introductions were found to be accidental, And that included plants that came as contaminants in seed or in livestock or with livestock, and packaging, as well as ballast. But that ballast, people may have heard of transport of marine organisms in ballast water, but for plants, ballast represents a small portion of the introductions. And then 28% of these plants, the authors were unable to determine the route of introduction. And I'll note that it's quite possible and likely, in fact, that many of the plants that we are dealing with today were introduced by multiple pathways, as well as in multiple occurrences or instances. So in many cases, these plants were brought not a single time, but in multiple introduction events over time. So this was a nice summary of how these plants arrived here. And Pamela, I'm just going to rely on you to monitor folks who are asking questions. And if there's anything that seems pressing, please just break in. Otherwise, thanks folks for your patience, and we will do our best to get to all of your questions at the end. So in terms of how plants move around once they arrive here, they spread in a variety of ways, and I note that this can be spread via seeds or fragments of plants in some cases. And in many instances, we can prevent these routes of spread. So this graphic both illustrates ways that they spread and also can help us think about ways that we as landowners or land managers can be smart and prevent these introductions. So starting at the top left, we have a gentleman on a mower. And so this kind of equipment, when it's moved from site to site or even within a site, can transport seeds or fragments of invasive plants. There's lots of nooks and crannies in the mower. The mower deck itself can be contaminated. So that is one vector for spread of invasive species. Moving on to the top middle photograph where we see rows and rows of plants lined up for growth or sale. It is true that the horticulture industry and people's desire for novelty and things that are unusual and bright and different colors has been a factor in the spread of invasive plants. And so that is another way that these plants have spread around. Recreationalists in the top right, you're seeing a pair of hiking boots with some mud on them and a pet. We ourselves can transport these plants around when we recreate in natural areas. And so this poster is encouraging everyone to brush off your boots and check your beloved canine companion before you leave the natural area to try to make sure you're not inadvertently transferring seeds in your gear. That also is familiar to many of us. If we are boaters, the Clean, Drain, Dry campaign for boats and trailers encourages us to clean off our boat and dry it out before it goes into another water body and drain it before we leave the site. So again, just good practices for us as we think about how we move around. And I know folks are outdoors perhaps more than ever right now during this pandemic. So this is especially important. I like to keep a little boot brush in my truck and try to spend a minute before we leave the field site knocking off any extra mud which could carry seeds. And people have said, well, where are you doing that? And I thought, well, the parking lot, that is a place that can be easily monitored, and folks are very likely to spot a new invasive plant there. So in the bottom left, we're showing a fork loader here with hay. And so that material can have plant seeds in it and could be a source, but also manure and mulch could bring those plant seeds or fragments to your property. So keeping an eye on those locations on your property where any material has been brought in, that's very important to prevent the establishment of invasive plants or to nip them in the bud if you do see something undesirable growing in an area where you've recently had some work done, or near where you keep animals if you've had feed brought in or bedding, etc. The bottom middle is showing a skidder there, and of course, forestry equipment is another way that invasive plants can hitch a ride, just like the mowing equipment. So if you're having any kind of timber harvest done on your property, you could consider asking the logger or contractor to clean the equipment before it arrives at your property. And if you know that you have invasive plants in your woodlot, you could consider providing a way for the logger to clean the equipment, or acknowledging that that is a potential cost that you as a landowner are willing to bear, and asking the logger to clean the equipment before it leaves your property and goes to your neighbor's property or to someone else's property. It's a good practice even if you don't know if you have invasive plants on your property. They could be there, and so cleaning equipment is kind of like giving invasive species the brush off when we're recreating. It's just a good hygiene practice. I know we're all thinking about hygiene during this pandemic. And so as we think about ways that we share equipment in our landscapes, hygiene is also important. In the bottom right, we're seeing a photograph of a stream crossing that has been rebuilt, culverts here. And so there's two potential ways that invasive plants could move around associated with things in this photograph. So the first is water. And of course, the movement of water can transport plants, or plant roots can get undercut by moving streams or by floodwaters that spread out and then recede and carry plant seeds or fragments. And we can't really control that, but we can just keep an eye on those areas on our property where we have flowing water, and maybe check those more regularly to see if anything new is growing there that we don't recognize. So that's just something for folks to be aware of, really, and to perhaps monitor more intensively, because those habitats are very important for wildlife. We know that rivers and streams are important corridors for wildlife movement in the landscape, and great habitat for many species. I'm sure many folks who have these features on their properties really treasure them for both the joy that kind of the lovely gurgling movement of water brings us, and also for the value for wildlife. So as you visit those areas, just keep an extra eye out for invasive plants. And then fill. So if you have some road work done and fill needs to be brought in, or if you have an instance like this where a culvert is replaced, unfortunately, the fill could be contaminated with invasive plant material. And so again, it's a question of monitoring those sites to make sure that nothing undesirable grows, and nipping that in the bud if we find something undesirable. So if you're having some construction done, it's just a good rule to revisit that site, during the next growing season, and make sure that nothing unwanted is sprouting up. So this is kind of an overview of how these species get around. And you'll note that this is mostly focused on how humans assist in their transport. Of course, many of these species are also moved by wildlife, and so birds can disperse many invasive plants. Mammals can also disperse them, raccoons and rodents and other things that feed on seeds and fruits. So I've really focused mostly on the things that are possible for us to control. In terms of, yes, go ahead, Pam.
Yeah, so while you're discussing how they spread, there was a few questions people seem to be curious about. Horses. Do horses spread any specific invasives when allowed on land, either through their hoofs or waste left behind? Additionally, how much of a vector are horses?
That's a good question, Pamela, thank you. The short answer is I don't know. I don't know how much of a vector they might be. I was just listening to a webinar the other day on the use of goats for invasive species control, and there was a recent study which has just been published regarding passage of seeds through the goat digestive system. And of course, I know horses are different than goats, but this is an example that I am aware of where we have data. And it was a very, very small percentage of, this was focused on one species in particular, buckthorn, common buckthorn. Goats had been brought in to intentionally graze the buckthorn, or browse, I should say, browse the buckthorn. and they measured the viability of seeds after they had passed through the goat's digestive system, and it was very, very low. It was less than 2%, if I'm remembering correctly. Seeds that passed through intact and that actually were viable. So if that is any kind of a guide, I would say that it seems like there's a low risk there in terms of the horses ingesting something and then going someplace else and defecating. It's an interesting question about horse feed, because sometimes the feed itself could include small invasive plant seeds, and that is a little bit less clear. The study made an important point, which is that the size of the seed probably makes a difference. They reviewed other studies also and found that seeds greater than 4 millimeters in length seem to be more efficiently destroyed by the digestive process of goats, whereas seeds or livestock in general, the study had two parts. One was the goat study, and then one was a review of other literature about this question. I'm remembering now as I speak. And the second part about the literature review was finding that seeds less than 4 millimeters in length had a higher pass-through rate. So there would be more danger for smaller seeded plants. So all that to say, I don't know specifically for horses in terms of the gut. I think that for definitely material that's trapped in the hooves could transport invasive plant seeds. So that would be another thing to clean as you're leaving the site. Thanks for that question. And Pamela, if you can make a note, I will try to remember to share a link to the paper that I just referenced regarding goats. So in terms of spread, we've thought about some things, and then when they arrive in their dispersed locations, people often wonder, why are they so successful? You know, why are they so robust? Why do they have so many fruits? And the first thing is really that they thrive on disturbance. So these are typically species which are adapted to take advantage of disturbance. And we are good at creating disturbance as we work and play in our landscape. So whether that's, you know, through a careful timber harvest, or whether that's as we're doing maintenance to make our camp road more robust and less eroding, all of that, even though it's beneficial, can be thought of as a disturbance where we might be changing the soil or opening the tree canopy a little bit. So they can take advantage of that just because of their kind of genetics and their evolutionary history. They also have competitive advantages compared to our native plants. They're not usually eaten by animals like deer or, more importantly, insects. So insects are in a very, very important control on plants, and plants and insects have very tightly co-evolved relationships. And because these plants are from mostly other continents, they don't have their native herbivores that keep them in check back in their sort of home locations. So that's a very important factor. They're not usually eaten. They don't have that kind of pressure on them. Many can put out early leaves and hold their leaves very late. So, you know, in the spring, I'm sure many of you have noticed some plants leaf out earlier than others. And in the bottom left photo here, you're seeing an example of a shrubby honeysuckle leafing out very early in the understory of a deciduous forest. And they hold their leaves, many of these invasive plants, late in the season as well. So glossy buckthorn, common buckthorn, they're still photosynthesizing in the fall. And that gives them an extra sort of push of energy that they're able to store in their root systems and get going next year. And then because they're not eaten, because they have these other competitive advantages like the early leaf out and the late leaves, they're able to really push out the reproduction. So these fruits on the shrubby honeysuckle, there's so many of them. We wish that our high bush blueberries looked like this all the time, right? They just, because they don't suffer from these predatory factors and they have some competitive advantages, they're able to be very fecund. And so they are dispersing a lot of propagules. So those are some of the reasons for why they're so successful in our landscapes. or in our natural areas is what I really mean by landscapes. In terms of the harm that they do, I think the first harm is to outcompete native plant species and just overrun the habitats. So this is a photograph of my colleague Don Cameron, who's about 6 feet tall, and he's standing in front of some trees that have completely been swamped by Asiatic bittersweet vines. And you can see the vines, the vines themselves just kind of snaking out over the tops of the trees. The vines are also forming a blanket on the wildflowers and herbaceous plants that are in the foreground here. So this is just a bad example of an infestation where the invasive vines, the Asiatic bittersweet, has just completely overrun this habitat. So that's a very obvious harm that the invasive plants can do. And I want to note that even sometimes when we can't see it, there is harm going on. So the damage can be direct or it can be more indirect. So on the left here, we're seeing again Asiatic bittersweet vines, and they are twining around these tree saplings, and they're effectively girdling the trees and killing them. So that's a very obvious harm. We can see it with our eyes. It makes me very sad in the forest when I see this. And on the right here is a photograph of an invasive plant, garlic mustard, which is in bloom, or was in bloom last week, at least in Portland. I don't know about where you are, but this is a plant that flowers pretty early. And this is an invasive herbaceous plant, and the harm that it does is harder to see. So this can form patches, and the plant secondary compounds disrupt beneficial soil fungi in the soil. So down in the soil where we can't really see what's going on, there is an interaction happening that is breaking beneficial relationships and causing changes in the soil fungi. And soil fungi are so important for our native plants. Just like plants and insects have beneficial co-evolved relationships, so do plants and fungi. And many of our plants need the soil fungi in order to be healthy and thrive. And so the garlic mustard is creating an environment where the soil fungi community is changed, and it's not favorable to our native plants. And so even if we pull up the garlic mustard, the changes in the soil persist. So they don't go on forever. They do attenuate over time, but this is a harm that we can't see with our eyeballs, and it's difficult to measure. So scientists have had to, work very carefully to try to determine what's going on. Why do we see these big patches of garlic mustard with nothing else growing there? And they've been able to figure this out. But for many invasive plants or many non-native, potentially invasive plants, we don't have that kind of research. We don't know what they're doing in the soil. And so there's just a reminder that we don't always see the damage, and we can't always easily measure it. So even if it's not obvious, we have to be careful about some of these plants. As I noted, the invasive plants can displace the native trees, shrubs, and wildflowers that are important parts of our natural systems. So this hillside in central Maine has been covered by shrubby honeysuckle. And so if I was a forest landowner, I'd be pretty sad to see this photograph, because you're not getting healthy tree growth in the understory here. So the seedlings and the young saplings of trees would have a very hard time competing with this shrubby honeysuckle, because the honeysuckle is so dense. It's creating dense shade. And so that's a problem for the next generation of trees and shrubs, and probably wildflowers too. This is just a dramatic example. The plants also alter wildlife habitat. So on the left here, we're seeing a dense stand of the common reed, or Phragmites, in a salt marsh near Popham Beach State Park. And this is a plant that can exist in the brackish zone and at the high edge of salt marshes. And so it can take over that high salt marsh habitat and really change it. The salt marsh hay that would normally be growing here, the Spartina patens, is a low growing, tuft forming not tuft, but cowlick forming grass, and it provides habitat for some of our rare salt marsh birds. There's a salt marsh sparrow, and a sharp-tailed sparrow, which are rare and provide, the high marsh provides their breeding habitat. But Phragmites does not provide breeding habitat for them. And so as the Phragmites takes over that habitat, it really changes it in ways that are important for wildlife and detrimental to wildlife that we're trying to conserve. On the right, you're seeing an infestation of hardy kiwi vine. This is a long-lived woody vine that can form these dense mats. It's growing both sort of sprawling over the foreground here, as well as climbing up into the trees and, you know, laying on the trees. Excuse me. So that's another example of a system that, you know, if you are a bird or an arboreal mammal, this just does not look like a normal forest habitat to you. I don't have data to sort of quantify this, but just with the naked eye, we can see that this has been transformed from a forest with, you know, just wildflowers and shrubs and saplings and canopy trees into something different. So these are known changes to habitats. But I think really the most important thing to take away about invasive plants and the harm that they pose is that they harm the food webs that depend on native plants. So native plants are really important for our food webs, for wildlife habitat, because native plants support native insects. And so in this slide, we're seeing some pictures of native insects like the Luna moth and the caterpillar of the Luna moth. This is a truly stunning, beautiful insect. They fly at night, and if you're lucky enough to see one, it's a real treat. They're this kind of wonderful green color, sort of a silky green with pink leading edge on the forewings here. And this is probably a male. It's showing the very feathered antennae with which it seeks the pheromones of the female. The adult moths don't even feed. They just are looking for mates. It's the caterpillar stage that is the real eater. And anyway, this is just a beautiful, lovely insect that we are lucky to have in Maine, and it requires certain species of plants. Just like the monarch butterfly, the caterpillars require milkweed. Many insects have these kinds of specialized relationships because plants don't want to be eaten in general. They vigorously defend their tissues. They have chemistry that makes it so that we can't just go outside and start eating plants. Most plants are distasteful. They have defensive compounds. And over many, many millennia, insects have evolved to be able to eat these particular plants or plant families. And so there's some specialization there. And so if we start replacing the native plants with invasive plants, we are removing those food sources for our native insects. And that is of top concern because insects are really the basis for how a lot of fat and protein gets transferred up the food web. We all know that the sun provides energy and that plants can transform that energy into tissue, into the lovely leaves and flowers and fruits that we eat, and many other things eat. But to get that fat and protein, really insects are taking the plant tissue and creating that fat and protein and transferring it to a lot of different kinds of animals, some of which we don't necessarily think of. So that's kind of a synopsis of invasive plant ecology. And that leads me into the next section here where what can we do about invasive plants? And I'm just looking at my watch and realizing how much time this has taken. So I'm going to fly through some of these invasive plant identification slides. So identification of invasive plants requires practice. So go outside, look at plants, use your free field guide that you'll be able to receive today or as a result of attending today. Use the Go Botany website to look at photos. Asiatic bittersweet is a woody vine that I've already talked about a little bit. It's very damaging. It has a alternate small oval or round leaves with teeth on the edges, and it can kill trees. It turns yellow in the fall. It's very distinctive at that time of year, and it has these fruits, which are also quite distinctive. Autumn olive is another woody plant. This one is a shrub, and it grows mostly in kind of open areas, and it has these kind of scaly leaves, which are distinctive if you look closely. It makes a reddish fruit, and as I said, it can grow more in sort of open habitats. It's not very shade tolerant. Black swallowwort and the sister species pale swallowwort are very destructive herbaceous vines. So they die back to the ground every year, but they're long-lived, they are perennial, and they form these pods, which are they're in the milkweed family, and so the pods split open and the seeds float away on the wind. The flowers are very, very small, maybe only about 1/3 of an inch, and in black swallowwort, they have sort of a purplish black flower, whereas the pale swallowwort, which we really don't have in Maine yet, is kind of a pale pink. That's a species, the black swallowwort is really a species of open habitats. Burning bush is an escaped ornamental shrub. This is a woody shrub with opposite leaves, and it has these corky wings on the twigs, and that's quite distinctive, and kind of a diminutive whitish greenish flower, known for its bright foliage color in the fall. Common buckthorn is a trickier plant to identify because it looks like a lot of our native species, and you can scrape the bark with a penknife, and on a larger stem, maybe 2 to 3 inches or larger, you can see this orange underbark, which is a nice helpful identification clue. Common buckthorn has subopposite leaves arrangement, so they're almost opposite, not quite, as opposed to alternate, meaning one after the other along the twig, or opposite directly across from one another. And the fruit of the common buckthorn is a juicy black berry that is dispersed by birds. This plant occurs in many forests in Maine and along the edges of fields as well. Common reed, I showed you that photograph of this plant near Popham Beach, mostly a threat to our salt marshes, although it will grow in freshwater marshes as well. Very, very, very tall grass. You can see in this top photo, for perspective, this is me, I'm about 5'5", and so these are very, very tall grasses. You can still see last year's seed heads on some tan standing stalks that are dead from last year. As you drive around, this can be found in ditches along the side of the road. Garlic mustard, I mentioned, this is the plant that changes the soil chemistry and fungi communities. This is a biennial plant, so it lives for 2 years. In the first year, you see these little rosettes, and then it bolts and forms a flowering stem. It has a 4-parted white flower that will form these long, skinny seed pods that will kind of open, and the tiny little black seeds will fall out. This is a plant of moist habitats, can grow both in the shade and in the sun. And as I mentioned, this was in flower in Portland about a week ago. Another buckthorn, glossy false buckthorn, is Frangula alnus. This is a shrub or a small tree, and this is one of my top species of concern in forests in Maine. This is a very sneaky plant. It looks like a lot of things. It looks like a cherry or sometimes even like a birch, but there are no teeth on the leaves. So this has a smooth leaf margin or edge. It's alternate in terms of the leaf arrangement along the stem. And it can have fruit of different colors on the same plant at the same time. So you're seeing in the top right photograph, it's got both black and red fruit at the same time. Sometimes you'll even see green fruit, which is kind of distinctive. Most plants ripen their fruit all at once, whereas this plant can have various stages going on. So this is a good one to take a minute to learn to recognize, because it's a very pervasive and destructive plant. It can grow very densely in the forest, even in deep shade, and crowd out other species. Japanese barberry, one of our escaped ornamentals, is another very destructive plant, forms dense thickets like you're seeing in the top right photograph here that leaf out fairly early. The red fruit is sort of tic-tac shaped and it hangs below the twigs. These are a spiny plant, very nasty to work with. And the thickets of these plants can harbor more than usual densities of ticks. And so we don't want these in our natural areas for multiple reasons. The roots of Japanese barberry and the inner tissue of the plant is a bright yellow color. So that's helpful when you're hacking away at it and trying to pull it out of the soil. Japanese knotweed, another very destructive invasive plant, which is a significant problem in stream and river habitats, riparian habitats. This is an herbaceous plant, but it's very long-lived, as anyone knows who's tried to get rid of it. And the tender shoots can be collected and eaten in various ways. Unfortunately, that will not eradicate your stand, but it's something to give you a little solace maybe in the springtime. This plant forms dense monocultures that crowd out native plants. Multiflora rose is another very thorny plant. It has strongly recurved thorns that point back along the stem. In the middle of June, it will have 5 parted white flowers that are very distinctive. And a good clue for identifying multiflora rose is that the base of the compound leaf has a fringed petiole, or really it's called a stipule, these little sort of leaf-like modified structures, and they're sort of little comey little fringes, like bangs kind of, on the edges of the leaf stem. So if you're trying to determine is something multiflora rose, look for the fringed base of the leaf stem. And if it has that sort of comb-like little fringe, that's multiflora rose. We don't have any other roses in Maine that have that character. The fruits are very small, about 1/3 of an inch or so, and clustered at the tips of the twigs. A plant that is spreading in Maine, not common everywhere yet, but very bad in the mid-coast, is ornamental jewelweed, which is also known as Himalayan balsam or pink jewelweed. This is an annual plant. It's fleshy, kind of herbaceous, like our native jewelweed. This is in the same genus as our native yellow jewelweed or touch-me-not. But this has a much larger pink flower. So the flowers on this plant are like maybe 1.5 inches from top to bottom. And they have the same kind of exploding seed pod action where once the seeds are ripe and you touch the pod, it will disperse them violently, maybe 1 meter or so. This is a real problem in damp areas along stream courses, and the seeds are transported by water. So although it's very easy to pull and very satisfying to pull, you have to keep at it because the seeds are viable down in the soil for several years. And it can easily form these dense stands like you're seeing in the lower right, which can be quite destructive in our riparian habitats. Purple loosestrife is a plant that many people have heard of. This is a wetland species that has a spike of flowers in the late summer. So we're talking like end of July, beginning of August. So this can be very destructive in wetlands. A little bit of a success story with biocontrol here with insects. There were several beetles that were raised to become a biocontrol and tested very carefully and released. And they have helped. Many populations that used to look like this on the top left are now more like a plant here and there. Excuse me while I plug in my cord. Great. And so it does have a very purplish flower stem, hence purple loosestrife. Shrubby honeysuckles are another top threat to the forest. These are another shade-tolerant shrub. And you can see in the lower left here, the pulse of flowering. This is another kind of flowering in the mid-June timeframe plant with these kind of spindly flowers with arms and legs that kind of go up and down. And a helpful key for the invasive honeysuckles is this hollow stem pith. Any kind of little chamber that's hollow in the center of the twig. The twig has to be, maybe the size of your pinky finger or greater to see this clearly. And that's helpful because we have some native shrub honeysuckles. We have a Canada honeysuckle, and the pith in that is solid. So it's a white kind of spongy pith as opposed to this hollow tube that you'll see on a larger stem of an invasive honeysuckle. Many of our invasive honeysuckles are also quite firm on the leaves, and our native Canada honeysuckle is not. So that's a helpful character. And you can see these juicy red fruits. Sometimes on the invasive honeysuckle, they can have an orange fruit. It just depends on the species and the plant, really. We have several species of invasive honeysuckle in Maine, but ecologically, they are all with similar impacts in the forest. Tree of Heaven is an invasive tree that luckily we don't have much of in Maine, but this is a tall canopy-sized tree. It has alternate compound leaves, which are very large, like 2 to 3 feet long, one leaf with many, many leaflets on either side. The leaflets have kind of a little mitten thumb at the bottom with a gland that's sort of circular that you can see if you're looking at the underside of the leaf. And this tree is important to report because it is host to a very destructive invasive insect called the spotted lanternfly, which again, we don't have in Maine, but it's very destructive to many different crops, apples and grapes and hops. And so we definitely don't want this insect in Maine, and we think that it's closely attracted to tree of heaven. So please report any suspicious or thought, any locations where you think there is tree of heaven in the landscape. It can look a little bit like a sumac, so look carefully. Sumac is a shrub, whereas this is a tall tree, and there are some additional differences. Sumac is really, really fuzzy on the stems, and this plant is not. But if you have any questions, please look it up in your invasive plant field guide or send me a photograph, and I'm happy to help you. And last but not least, we have yellow iris. This is another ornamental escape. This is a wetland plant that can invade the shores of ponds and lakes. We have several known infestations on some of our lakes in Maine, like Lake Peninsawasi or Norway, and it can also invade freshwater wetlands. This has a large seed pod. This is my hand against the seed pod, and this distinctive yellow, like 2 to 3 inch flower when it's in bloom. We have a native blue flag iris, and it can be difficult to tell them apart if the plants are not in bloom, but the seed pod is more robust in the yellow iris. But it's helpful to have a flower if you're trying to distinguish these. But the native blue flag is just overall a smaller plant, less robust, and does not form these really, really extensive colonies. So as promised, if you are attending today and you would like a free copy of our Maine Invasive Plants Field Guide, we'd like to give you one. And in this day of COVID-19, we will snail mail it to you. And this is a field guide which is spiral bound with 2 rings at the top, and it has waterproof identification cards for 46 species of invasive plants. It also includes information about how to control each plant, as well as numerous photographs. It's more or less like large pocket size, so like Carhartt pocket size, and it's waterproof. So if you'd like one, please send your name and your snail mail address to my email address, nancy.olmstead@maine.gov. And I'll show that email address again at my final slide. And if you're looking to purchase additional copies, you can do that through the Maine Natural Areas Program website. And there are a few local bookstores in Maine that are carrying this, COVID-19 permitting. I think many of these stores are closed right now, but some may be considering reopening in the next months. So tune in from 12 to 1 to hear more about addressing invasive plants, managing them. I'll cover the other aspects of kind of my 5-step plan here at that time. You can use the same Zoom link to tune in at that time if you wish. I'll also cover our IMAP invasives mapping tool. And so here's my email address again, and I'll just leave that there. And Pamela, I know we have only about 8 minutes scheduled, but please, let's hear any questions.
Well, this is Marjorie.
Great, thanks, Marjorie.
You're welcome. There was one in the chat box asking, do you know what plants Luna moths are specialized to eat?
I looked that up, and I think it was some plants like sassafras and other plants that are not super common in Maine. And then there were some others, and I'm forgetting off the top of my head what they are, but that's a great question. I'm gonna note that and look it up again.
So another question in the Q&A, do you know what invasives are most likely to colonize or infest summit or alpine areas?
We're very lucky that most of these plants to date have not shown the ability or have not been dispersed and been able to colonize in those habitats. So our real high summit communities, I have not found invasive plants there. However, in the mid-coast, like in the Camden Hills, there are populations of glossy buckthorn and Asiatic bittersweet. I want to say some other plants. There's a common barberry. So there are plants which can colonize the low rocky summits, and including those that I just said, Asiatic bittersweet, glossy buckthorn. We've seen common barberry. So those are a handful of the ones that I have observed, but nothing, I haven't observed anything like, you know, in the Mahoosucs or at Baxter or anything like that, you know, knock on wood.
I think you're going to address this at noon, Nancy, but someone is asking, after removing a big area of honeysuckle and multiflora rose, what should they do to the ground to prevent reinfestation or more invasives?
Yeah, that's a great question, because sometimes when we take action to manage the invasive plants, we're disturbing the area, and so we have to monitor that. I think the top thing is to be present in that area and pull up new seedlings. It depends a little bit on the site. You know, replanting with natives can be a good thing if you're far enough along that they have a good chance of survival. You know, if the area is still vigorously resprouting from roots, then it might not be time yet to plant natives. But, you know, if it's a small enough area, you could mulch temporarily and pull any resprouts and then plan to plant later on. I know mulching, you know, is not always the best thing, but those are some immediate thoughts. I think really the key thing is to monitor and try to keep ahead of seed sprouts or root sprouting, and, you know, maybe do some targeted plantings of hardy things that can compete well to sort of start the site off, and then gradually introduce more plantings over time as you are. And you know, native plants will often recruit into those areas too. So you might leave some areas for natives to seed in, and again, just keeping an eye on the site to try to evaluate what's happening.
Thank you. Do you have suggestions for getting rid of Japanese knotweed?
Yeah, I do. That is a difficult plant. It depends on the size of the stand and the habitat that it's in, and age of the stand. Small patches are much more manageable. If the plants are, so I'm gonna just list some things quickly, because this could take a whole webinar by itself. So solarization, like covering with tarps or carpets, that is effective, but it takes a long time and it takes maintenance. There are herbicides that can be used either alone or in combination with mechanical cutting. There also are situations where repeated mechanical cutting can eliminate the patch over time, but you have to be real careful with any kind of equipment that you're using to cut it, because any little piece of the green stem that has a node or any sections of roots can create new plants. So you just have to be very mindful of the tools you're using. They're working on a biocontrol, but don't hold your breath. It's got a long way to go, and they haven't really shown that it like severely damages the plant. So those are some immediate thoughts. Japanese knotweed is tough. Our website does have a whole page that goes into more depth, frankly, than we were able to include in this small space of the field guide. So I encourage folks to look for the Maine Natural Areas Program web gallery of invasive plants, where we have links to videos about how to control the plants and a little bit more detail than we were able to provide in our field guide. Good luck. Japanese knotweed is tough. Keep at it.
We have 3 minutes left, and someone's asking what's the best attack for garlic mustard?
I think pulling for garlic mustard, it is fairly simple to pull. And I would, you know, right now is a great time to get on that, because you want to try to get it before the seed pods form. The seed pods, when they're ripe, are very fragile, and you can very easily disperse a lot of seeds when you move through the stand. So pulling early in the season is a good strategy for garlic mustard. And I would bag the plants and dispose of them as trash, just in case there's any seeds already starting to be viable in there.
Thank you. Pamela, someone's asking how they might be able to access the recording when this is over.
Yes, absolutely. So we will have it available on our extension website, likely in where you went to access the webinars in the first place. And I believe, Nancy, you guys will be posting it as well.
Yes,
Okay,
that's
so
correct, Pamela.
great. So what I'll do is I'll send everyone an email who registered for the class to let you know that yes, it's available. Check it out on these websites so you can access them pretty easily. And while we have a pause here, I just want to mention that I did share a few links in the chat box, and one of them is the Maine Natural Areas Program website, which has all of those wonderful pictures and fact sheets and information that Nancy had been referencing throughout her talk. I also shared a link for our demographics survey, which is optional, but we really would like to know who we're reaching with our program. So if you don't mind filling that out after today's webinar, that would be wonderful.
And that reminds me, Pamela, we had planned some polls to do during this webinar and we didn't have a chance to do them. I don't know if folks might be interested in staying on for an optional poll if we have capacity to do that at the end.
It's 9:59 and there are more questions about controlling specific invasives. So is that something you can address at noon?
Yes, I sure can.
Okay.
I will go over that at noon. There are many, I just want to caution folks that there are many invasive plants, and I can't cover every single one in great detail in terms of the control methods. I will refer folks to the web gallery of invasive plants, which has many of these species that I've presented today, and it has the control strategies that are found in our field guide. So even though you won't have the field guide in your hands yet, you can access that stuff online. And also, if folks have really tricky situations, or if you think you might have a suspicious plant but you're not sure, please feel free to send photographs to my email address. I will ask your patience. As you can imagine, I get a lot of these inquiries, and so it may take 10 days or 2 weeks for me to respond to you right now, but I will respond to you eventually. So if you have questions, or if it's a difficult situation that might be better discussed in a phone call, we could do that as well.
Nancy, one last question. Are any of the invasive plants beneficial in any way?
Sure. Yes, is the short answer. So I've spoken with many beekeepers, for example, that really treasure stands of Japanese knotweed because bees will nectar on it and it produces a very sweet tasting honey. And there are other examples. So some of these plants were brought to stabilize soil at mine tailings and those kinds of habitats, and they did that job pretty well. So I don't think of these mostly as very like black or white. I think about, what are the benefits and then what are the impacts? And for all the plants that I have showed you today, it is my professional scientific opinion that the impacts of the plant greatly outweigh any modest benefits that they provide. So that is my assessment of these plants. But it's not a black and white world. I recognize that. I know that there is interest in many plants, using plants for food, for medicine, and I don't want to discount that, but I do think I ask folks to consider the whole universe of how the plant behaves and whether the sum of the impacts are negative or positive. Sometimes I know it's challenging to evaluate that, but that's what we're called to do at the Natural Areas program. So that's the approach that we take, with particular focus on trying to make sure that we are prioritizing native plants and wildlife and habitats. So that's kind of our perspective, and that's how we approach those kinds of questions.
All right. Well, with that said, I think we're going to have to wrap it up because we're a few minutes after 10. And as Nancy mentioned, we are using the same Zoom link and information for our talk at 12. So even if you didn't register for that talk in advance, feel free to just join us. It'll be the same format, and we'll try to get to all of your questions about control measures. But as Nancy mentioned, there's a lot to cover. So what we'll also do in that discussion is be sure to share emails and resources so that you know, kind of spread the love here and give you context for people at UMaine Extension that might be able to assist with some of these questions. I'm sure Nancy is going to get a lot of questions.
Right, and yes, I should say, yes, of course. My colleagues at Cooperative Extension in many cases are just as qualified as I am to answer some of these questions. So we should maybe put your email addresses up on the screen too. Pamela, is it possible to go ahead and share those polls for anyone who's still on the line? I'm curious to, I had meant to ask kind of what was people's background as you're joining today. Are you a residential homeowner? Are you a forest landowner, etc.? And so if anyone who's still on the call would take just a second to respond to the poll, that helps us understand who the audience is today. And what your interests are. So I do see the poll. Hopefully other people do too.
I see it too, but no one is voting, so I'm wondering if they can't see it.
Yeah. Pamela, can you double check that that's exposed to attendees?
I believe it is, and I'm wondering if Serge is on the call here, if he is seeing this, might be able to assist.
Looks like some people are reporting that they can see it, but they can't submit.
Okay.
And others are just working on it. The submit button is not working.
Oh.
Okay.
I wonder if it's because we're over our time.
It could even be that there's multiple questions and you might have to answer all of them in order to hit submit.
Okay.
I see one person has submitted an answer.
I see. Okay, so yeah, it is there is some of them are long questions. Yes. Right. And so we've got also the questions that were meant for the second webinar. Oh, well, that's okay.
Yeah, well, people are responding, so this is helpful.
Yeah, that's great. And we could ask the same questions again later. That would be fine too. So thank you everyone who's responding. And yes, it's not a really quick poll. It might take you 2 or 3 minutes, 4 minutes to go through it. Yeah, so if the submit button is not working, I wonder if you have to answer every question. That's the only thing that we have been coming up with as to why that might not be working.
Yep, looks like Rosemary is confirming. Yes, you have to answer all of them. And it looks like about 50% of participants have answered, so that's good.
Great. And we also understand if you need to get off the call and don't have time to do that today, no problem. Thank you everyone for attending. Thanks, Marjorie.
So what I'll do is I'll just end the poll and share the results with everyone if people are curious. Great. Before we close out here. There we go. So everyone should be able to see the results there.
Yeah, so it looks like we had many residential homeowners on the call and some family forest landowners, gardeners, some natural resource professionals, teachers and students, terrific. And many folks reporting that autumn olive and black swallowwort were new to them today, as well as glossy buckthorn. So I'm glad I highlighted that. Ornamental jewelweed, tree of heaven. Okay, so several plants that were new to folks. And that makes sense because those are the plants that are less common in Maine to date, except for glossy buckthorn. That one's common, except tricky to spot sometimes. And autumn olive, that one's pretty common too. And in terms of methods that folks are using, looks like a lot of people are using mechanical methods as well as some manual methods as well as some mechanical methods. Not a lot of folks into flame weeding. I can understand that. It takes some specific equipment. And in terms of any limitations for management, looks like some folks are not limited on their properties. Other folks are not sure how to manage. Or it's simply, funding or lack of time, or not sure how to identify. Great. Well, thank you, Pamela, for all of that.
No problem. And thank you everyone for joining us. And for those who kind of stayed on here a little bit longer, we will have the recording available and we'll be in touch about that. And thank you, Marjorie and Nancy.
My pleasure.